Cauldron Lake is a mysterious body of water located in Bright Falls, Washington. The Native Americans who occupied the area used to call it a doorway to the underworld, whilst town locals...
This place is crazy! Disappearances, mysterious deaths, urban legends come true, and get this, most of this stuff takes place around Cauldron Lake.
Barry, geez, okay, I was getting to it, chill. Like I was saying, a lot of strange happenings have taken place over the course of the years, and, as fate would have it, there is a giant influx of these occurrences around, you guessed it, Cauldron Lake. But what is really lurking in the depths of Cauldron Lake? What has happened to those that have mysteriously disappeared? Is it just small town stories growing wild, or is there more to it? Let's find out. So, just to preface this, Cauldron Lake is a fictional location created by Remedy Entertainment in the world of Alan Wake and the Remedyverse. So you don't need to worry about exploring the mountains of Washington and stumbling upon a strange lake that's probably going to mess up your day. Well, at least not this lake in particular. Cauldron Lake was named as such because it is in fact a caldera, which I had never heard of until I started researching this game. It was also briefly touched upon in the third episode whilst examining an informational sign as Alan traverses his way down to the lake. For those of you who, like me, have never learned about calderas, these are rare formations created by a particularly violent volcanic eruption. Think the morning after you have a particularly spicy curry and you may catch my drift. Underground, there are chambers of magma that during this eruption will start to empty, resulting in the ground above collapsing and forming a cauldron-like recess. Not always, but sometimes these depressions fill with water, and thus a lake is formed. Now, we don't know exactly when Cauldron Lake came to be, but we do know that it has been there for at least a couple of centuries, with how the timelines in the game work. The earliest date mentioned specifically is 1878, which is when the Bright Falls Mining Company was founded and Bright Fall coal mines were opened. Before this, and before the town of Bright Falls was even on the map, Native Americans inhabited the land and spoke of Cauldron Lake and their speculations that it was a doorway to the underworld. Now, this isn't necessarily proof that the strange happenings around the lake dated that far back, but it does suggest that there was a level of unease around those mysterious depths. But what are these strange happenings, and why is it all centered around an old lake? Well, let's dive a little deeper. Now, just as a warning, this is where we start getting into spoiler territory. We will be discussing in more depth certain events in Alan Wake and touching on a couple of things that are explained in Control, another Remedy Entertainment game that is part of the Remedyverse. So if you don't want any spoilers, then please click away now. But not before liking and subscribing. God, I hate doing that. For those of you who haven't played Alan Wake, I will give you a brief introduction into the story before we explore Cauldron Lake much further. Alan Wake is a novelist that travels to Bright Falls with his wife Alice in the hopes of recovering from a 2-year-long bout of writer's block. Whilst there, they are led to stay at a cabin on an island within Cauldron Lake. After an explosive argument about Alice's ulterior motives for the trip, she is taken by unseen forces whilst Alan has stormed off a little way away from the cabin. When he returns to find her gone after rushing back upon hearing her screams, he sees her figure in the lake below and dives in after her. Now this is where things take an intense turn. When Alan dives beneath the water, he is transported to a place that we come to know as the Dark Place. I feel like this is the part where we'll need to get a counter on screen because we're going to be saying that word a lot. Comment below how many times you think I'll have said dark by the end of the video. The Dark Place is somewhere we don't really learn much about until much later in the game, as when Alan first enters the Dark Place, he actually loses an entire week, and we only see snippets of his time there on television sets littered around the town of Bright Falls. In these small clips, we come to learn that Alan has been writing in that lost time. Not only had he been writing, but he had also seemingly been predicting the future happenings around the town of Bright Falls. Whilst exploring the world, trying to make our way to a gas station in episode 1, Alan stumbles upon manuscript pages that he wrote in the past week. These pages told a horror story, not Alan's usual genre of choice, and had the uncanny ability to come true the further we progressed. Whilst fighting his way through the woods and battling locals and tourists taken over by seemingly dark forces, Alan presses on. Armed with a torch and a pistol, he continues to try to find his wife. But what does this all have to do with Cauldron Lake? See, Cauldron Lake is more than just a caldera. It is also something known as a threshold, which is a place that acts as a connection between Earth and other dimensions. I know, sounds pretty crazy, right? But bear with me. When Alan hit the surface of the lake, he didn't just sink to the bottom, he was transported. And the place that he was transported to is an integral part of the story of this game, despite only being mentioned a handful of times throughout, and it's only really explored in episode 6, towards the climax of the story. There's a reason that Thomas Zane describes Cauldron Lake as having more beyond, where lies a deeper, darker ocean green. Cauldron Lake may appear to be just a small body of water, but what lies below is a vast, unimaginable expanse. But why is this so important? Well, it's because of this threshold that this story is able to unfold as it does. The Dark Place isn't just another world that happens to house some powerful entities, no. It is far more than that. Alan describes it as being unlike anything he could have ever imagined. It wasn't solid, it flowed. It was conceptual and subjective. For someone else, an artist in another field, it could have been very different. The Dark Place is somewhere that works of art such as writing, poetry, and even paintings can influence and change reality. Imagination is king and extremely powerful in this dimension. In another manuscript page that is actually found in Control, a game we discussed earlier, Alan tells the reader about how he used to know where fiction ended and reality began. But during his time in the Dark Place, they've started to become one and the same. A rogue thought could be made real, and he may never be able to tell if he has finally escaped or if he is just trapped in his own fantasy. The connection between the Dark Place and Cauldron Lake is the reason why Alan's stories are able to alter reality around the area of Bright Falls. This power passes through the threshold and into the real world, twisting those in its path until the story is adhered to. However, and this is a big however, there is a really important thing that some people tend to miss when they think of the Dark Place and its mysterious powers. There are rules. One can't simply write something into existence, just like one couldn't simply walk into Mordor. There has to be a story to it, and the story has to make sense. So what exactly does this mean? I feel like this is a good point to introduce the main antagonist of this game, the Dark Presence. See, I told you we'd be saying dark a lot, didn't I? To try and make this a little less obnoxious, I will be referring to the Dark Presence as Barbara Jagger for the rest of the video. Though I won't go into too much depth with it in this, Barbara Jagger is essentially an avatar for the Dark Presence, a form that it was able to take back in 1970 during its interactions with Thomas Zane, the poet. Now, Barbara Jagger resides in the Dark Place and has done for an indeterminate amount of time. Whilst it is an incredibly powerful being in its own right, it still has to obey the rules of the Dark Place. This being has the desire to escape, but it can't simply just will that into existence. That's just not how things work. So it has to rely on that of a creative mind, someone that can tell a balanced story whilst being guided in the malicious direction that Barbara Jagger wants. Referred to as the editor on occasion throughout the game, it manipulates those it has touched, finding loopholes in their stories to fit its own purposes. Throughout the story, it grows stronger, using both Alan's manuscript and the powers of the Dark Place to build towards its end goal. This plan is ultimately foiled, for the time being. But it's because of these rules in the Dark Place that Barbara Jagger can't just up and leave. It can't manifest its own exit door and just mosey on out. The story needs to take it there. And this is another interesting aspect of these rules. Even the story has to be its own character. Alan mentions that the departure, the story he is writing for Barbara Jagger, is a horror story. And I believe that this is a key component as to why Alan has to sacrifice himself to save Alice. Because horror stories aren't just happy endings. It's that moment of peace before realising that the monster is still hiding under your bed, or that the demon never left the house. The Dark Presence is still out there, and Alan gave up his freedom and safety to ensure that at least his wife could go on without him. I will explore the Dark Presence, Thomas Zane, the Bright Presence, and Barbara Jagger more in a separate video at some point, as these entities are a key component of the Dark Place in Alan's story. But it's worth noting here that they as well are still in the Dark Place, still hidden beneath Cauldron Lake, and I'll be really interested to see how they are explored even further in Alan Wake 2.